Well, I think we're live now. Welcome to our science speaker series and special presentation of the Jim and Linda Lee Planetarium tonight. I'm Noel Richardson. I'm a professor at Embry-Riddle, and it is my pleasure tonight that we have a guest that is as awesome as she is, and her name is Emily Levesque. She is a professor at the University of Washington in astronomy. And not only is she an amazing astronomer, she also just wrote a popular science book called The Last Stargazers. And tonight, Emily and I are going to tell you a little bit about what astronomers do when we're not in our offices, when we're not teaching, so that you know kind of what the lifestyle is for one of possibly the most extreme sciences that's out there. So, Emily, welcome.
Hello, it's great to be here. And hi to everybody who's watching.
So, Emily, I always find that every astronomer I talk to has a favorite telescope. And I was just curious, what is your favorite telescope or site to visit?
See, I keep changing favorite telescopes based on the kind of science that I want to do or the kinds of questions that I want to answer, which is one of the points that I try to make in The Last Stargazers, because you really need such a wide variety of telescopes to do your science. It would be, like having a favorite kitchen implement. You need so many different things to cook a meal, and you need so many different abilities to observe. I do think that if I had to pick a favorite place, it would be Las Campanas Observatory, which is one of the telescopes down in Chile. I know that I believe we have photos up on the screen right now, so I can show a gorgeous picture taken by Yuri Beletsky of Las Campanas. And these are the twin Magellan telescopes named Bada and Clay. And you can see this gorgeous photo of them with the southern Milky Way overhead. But it is such a wonderful place to observe. You still observe there in the very classic sense where you travel through the telescope and you sit in the control room all night and come with the data plan ahead of time. The dark sky there is just astonishing, and these are wonderfully powerful telescopes. Each telescope is a mirror that's 6.5 meters across. I've done some of my favorite science with these telescopes, so if I had to pick, that would be my favorite.
Outstanding. For me, my favorite is still the first one I ever went to, which was, as a grad student, the first one I traveled to was Mount Wilson. And I traveled there to use the Char Array interferometer, which allows us to, basically, we have 6 1-meter telescopes, and they're spread out across the mountaintop. And we make it into one super telescope to allow it to combine light and image stars or resolve really, really close binaries. And I just, in case anyone is possibly watching, I wanted to thank all the wonderful firefighters that recently saved the mountain. This was a really close call. One of the many wildfires going on in California was the Bobcat fire, and it actually got within about 6 feet of one of the structures on the mountaintop. This is one of the webcam views. There's several of them. One of them even has, the plane dropping fire retardant on the side of the mountain. And I think it's maybe a safe place to put a telescope because they also have over $1 billion worth of communication equipment on the mountaintop. So that helped, I think, prioritize the mountain. But in these pictures where you see this huge fire going on in the background, you can see a couple of the small domes with the little silver tops on them, and those are part of the Char Array that I love when I'm there. And it's amazing to go to these places because not only do we have this really modern, amazing instrument that I used, but it's right next to this classic observatory that was one of the first large telescopes built. And when Hale worked there, he built the largest telescope on the mountain, twice in history, where it was first the 60-inch and then the 100-inch. So I'm glad to see it saved. And I think one of the weird things for me, and you can obviously expand upon this, is how much different or how extreme some of the sites are that we put telescopes, because we need to be away from lights and we need to be higher up. And why don't you elaborate on that a little bit and some of the more extreme places that you've seen telescopes overall?
Oh yeah, this is one of those things that when I interviewed people, I interviewed more than 100 colleagues to write this book, and I asked everyone, what do you think would surprise somebody the most about our jobs? And people are very often surprised at how sort of expedition-esque astronomy can be, that we will wind up going to sites like Las Campanas, or sites like the place where I went on my very first observing run, which is Kitt Peak Observatory in Arizona. And just the act of getting to them is such an ordeal, but there's a good reason. You want these telescopes to be in the darkest, most remote places. You want to put them high on mountains where the air will be very dry and still, and thus perfect for astronomy. But it's an adventure to even get to them. And even something like Kitt Peak, which is a drive from Tucson, it's a long drive, and you're going up a road that is pretty decently finished in Kitt Peak's case. I think all of us have been on slightly more perilous observatory roads. And for something like an observatory in Chile, you'll be flying halfway around the world from your office in my case, Seattle, Washington. There's telescopes that we purposely put in intensely remote areas. I write about the Atacama Large Millimeter Submillimeter Array, or ALMA, down in Chile, which is up at 16,000, I believe even higher than 16,000 feet. And the safety of working at that kind of altitude and of working in the Atacama Desert, one of the driest places in the world, is just unreal. I also talked to people that worked at places like the South Pole Telescope, and getting down there is a famous ordeal. And to use a telescope, you need to be there at night. And in the South Pole, night lasts 6 months. So I talked to people who wintered over to work at that telescope, and just the unusualness of working in the most remote place in the world while still staying on the planet. So it's an adventure all on its own just to get to go to these places, and we get to see places you normally never would, which is just so wonderful.
How many astronomers in your interview told you that they had to learn how to drive a stick shift when they arrived at the observatory?
Multiple people told me stories that were some variant on, and then I couldn't drive the car, and then we had trouble getting up the road to the mountain. Some of the telescopes in Chile famously had a little fleet of VW bugs that were their observatory vehicles, and they had to retire these bugs to the heartbreak of some of the kind of old timers at the observatory, because they were stick shifts, and Americans were increasingly showing up unable to drive stick. I learned how to drive stick partway through my career as an astronomer, and was very happy the first time I could actually drive one of the cars. But yeah, there were many, many variants on trying to deal with the really perilous roads. I managed a very dumb car crash story. Fortunately, nobody was hurt. It was mostly my pride driving up the road in Hawaii that I talk about in the book, but it's a very universal astronomer experience.
I ruined a hubcap on a rental car once. Thankfully, I had the damage waiver. Apparently, a rock got off the road on my way up to Mount Wilson, and it bounced around in the hubcap and ripped it to shreds on the way up.
Oh, no.
But that's better than a colleague who
Yeah.
had an oil pan do the same thing. So,
Ugh.
yeah, they had a broken car by the time they got there.
Yeah, no, we'll destroy some cars in the service of, getting to the mountains. One of my favorite stories, though, is that occasionally telescopes will fight back, because most telescopes are built inside these domes, like the kind that you can see in the picture at Kitt Peak. But the domes will sit stationary and the telescope turns inside them. And there's a telescope in Arizona, the MMT, which used to stand for multi-mirror telescope until the mirror was upgraded to one single big mirror. So now it's just the MMT. It doesn't stand for anything. And that telescope is actually in a building that is a little too small for the telescope. So the telescope can't turn inside the building. The whole building turns. And the building has things like a slightly outjutting staircase, or parts that aren't entirely round and symmetrical. So there's a little line painted on the ground around it saying, don't park closer to the telescope than this, or else a piece of the building might swing into you. So apparently somebody did once manage to have a telescope hit their car. I really wish I could have gotten a hold of their insurance claim. Yeah.
I learned how to drive a stick while on an observing run at the South African Astronomical Observatory, where they also drove on the wrong side of the road. So I was learning how to drive a stick on a mountain on the left side of the road, which means I will never, ever be able to drive a stick with the stick on the normal side that you would drive with if you were to drive in the States. I had one student who, when observing for me, I was in the process of moving to my current job, and I had time at the Lowell Discovery Telescope with my institution I was a postdoc at. I had a night and a half, and it was just in the middle of all my moving for coming here to be a professor. And he decided to mountain bike like 50 miles to go down to the telescope. And surprisingly, he loved it and said he was never going to ever drive down there again. He was always going to mountain bike. So there are certainly some interesting folks in the way that they get to the observatory. You're telling me about Elizabeth Griffin. You should tell everyone about that.
Yes, and this is great too, because people are asking me about the stories that wound up on the cutting room floor. Because if this book was just an anecdote collection, and if I shared every story somebody told me, it would be 900 pages and completely impenetrable, but filled with this complete oral history of astronomy. And I did curate it into something of a story, but one of the stories I don't get to tell in the book, but I get to tell here, is of Elizabeth Griffin. I do write about her in the book because she was one of the first women to be a principal investigator at some of the telescopes in California. And there's a whole other story to that I imagine we can get into regarding women being banned from staying in the dormitories on the mountain and leading their own telescope time. So she was a pioneer in that regard. And she also spent years working at a telescope in British Columbia, where she bicycled up and down the road to work every day. And this is a steep mountain road with switchbacks and the whole nine to actually get up to the telescopes. And she cycled there well into advanced age. And I know that she had to stop at some point because she suffered a fall on the bike that she tells me she bounced back from quite robustly, but it eventually put an end to her cycling days. But she would, be getting passed by or passing by much younger cyclists and these young men who were just kind of looking at this tiny older lady just dauntlessly cycling up, and they're out for a workout. She's just going to work. So, yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of crazy ways to get to the observatory. That's for sure. So anyway, another thing that always strikes me is because we go to such remote places as an astronomer, there's always wildlife. And you must have had 10,000 stories of different wildlife that you see and that may complicate things along the way. And I'm just curious, what are your favorites?
Oh, it's hard to pick a favorite. I have pictures of some of our representative favorite critters, and they really run the gamut. I had heaps of, I think of them as critter stories, and I had, notes that were parsing them into like stories about insects, stories about mammals, stories about birds, stories about so-and-so. But I think a lot of people react most strongly to the guy on the upper left here, which is the very large tarantulas that hang out around the observatories in Chile. And they really are around, hand to small plate sized. And they look petrifying. They just look like an arachnophobe's nightmare. They're hairy and they've got the legs, but they're actually very gentle and very shy little creatures and are pretty scared of people. So a lot of times you will run across one and everybody freaks out and you can kind of see the tarantula going, ah! But they're infamous in their appearance just because they're so daunting looking. And I think everybody that spent any time at an observatory in Chile has run into one of these guys at one point. And you would expect that these would be the, insect-like scourge of astronomers everywhere. And the real villain that everybody likes telling me about are the guys on the upper right, which are the ladybug swarms. And closely related to those are the moth swarms. So in the American Southwest, people will get observatories will get swarmed by scads of ladybugs or huge numbers of moths. And the sheer number of them becomes brutal. They will clog domes. They will climb into equipment. They will skitter into electronics because they're heading for the warmth. And they can just become impossible to deal with. So I would ask people, and it sounded like, they're communicating stories from the front of held off the first swarm of ladybugs, second wave's coming, not sure if we're going to make it through the night. But it's really funny because these are, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they show up on radar for some of these observatories too.
Yeah, because the swarms are so big. And I love this as a juxtaposition because I'm talking to people who are trying to study things like supermassive black holes at the centers of galaxies, or explain why stars die and produce a supernova, or looking for signs of habitable planets. And they're these big, lofty, like far-reaching questions about the universe and who we are and how we got here. And you imagine an astronomer doing this research, and it's like somebody tipped back in their chair, like thinking deep thoughts about the universe, and instead they're like, ladybugs, no! Like, it's just the really prosaic day-to-day of trying to do science. But yeah, there's also some really wonderful treat animals that you just don't get to see in, day-to-day life here in the US. Like all of the things across the bottom of this slide are animals that I've been lucky enough to see in Chile. So guanacos, which are sort of wild llamas, Chilean condors, which are regular visitors around the observatories, and the little guy on the lower right, which is an animal called the vizcacha. It looks like a wise bunny grandfather. It's actually related to a chinchilla, and these guys hang out at telescopes in Chile, and they've gotten very famous because for whatever reason, they really love watching sunsets, which is something that astronomers also love to do. A group of people working at different telescopes on a mountain will sort of congregate and enjoy watching the sun go down. And you'll ask astronomers and they'll say, oh, we're getting, information about how nice the night is and about how clear the sky is. And people can make up science reasons. And we're watching it because it's beautiful and it's a wonderful time of night. And I don't know why the vizcachas are there, but they'll usually join us. You get these rows of little guys just perched there watching the sun go down alongside us. And it's this funny moment of creatures sharing a planet.
Absolutely. I remember when I was in Quebec as a postdoc, we had a 1.6 meter telescope I would go to sometimes. And this was on a little mountain in the eastern provinces of Quebec, which is a horrible observing site, but we had pretty much as much time as we could need to do our projects. And we would sit out on the catwalk and watch the sunset every night. I saw the green flash on the inside of the continent one time and it was an amazing night. And so that's something that's really, really great. And the other thing with the wildlife there was one time I was there and there were, I think, 3 or 4 students that were there, some undergrads and grad students. And there was a species of bird called the gray jay. And the gray jays are kind of like blue jays, but they're a lot friendlier. They're one of the nicest species of birds. And one of the students literally held out his hand and the bird came and hung out for like 10 minutes with him.
That's great.
Yeah, so there's all these wonderful things. And there was also the time where I was driving back from a telescope at Lowell back to where I was staying in Flagstaff, and
oh, I think we lost your sound. Unfortunately, I can see your mouth moving, but I'm not sure I can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm sorry about that. I think this is a side effect of Eric from the planetarium making me use headphones. And so anyway, there was a time where I was driving back to where I was staying, and there was probably 300 elk that I had to wait for a little bit to cross the road in order to get back to where I was going. And the animals are always great. So, Emily, your book is full of amazing stories. I've enjoyed a good chunk of the book already. And by the way, to anyone listening, if you have any questions for Emily or I, please feel free to throw them in the YouTube chat, and we'll be glad to answer those as soon as we can. So anyway, I think that one of the great things about being an astronomer is there's usually a lot of weird things that happen when you travel to the telescope. And I think the best story was the story of early on when everything was with glass plates, and there was an astronomer at the prime focus of the telescope riding along, taking his data, and the night assistant turned on the light. And You can tell this
Yes.
very well, so please tell me that. What's that story?
So to understand this story, first of all, it's good to just remind people of what a big modern telescope looks like. So this is a photo of the Palomar 200-inch, and it kind of helps you orient yourself in terms of how the telescopes are built, because at the very bottom of the screen is where the big main mirror of the Palomar telescope is sitting. And this mirror is 200 inches end to end, which is huge. And then high above it, you can see suspended what looks like a big tube. That tube actually holds the secondary mirror. And in Palomar's case, we'll bounce light now off of the primary up to the secondary and then down into a camera. Back in the day, we would sometimes put observers up at that focus point for the primary mirror. So we called it prime focus. So an astronomer would be sitting up there at the top of that picture, like dozens of feet above the floor. They would also be up there with these glass photographic plates that were how we stored old images. And these plates were so finicky and delicate and so difficult to use. You would order them from a company like Kodak, but then you would slice them down to size. You'd chemically treat them. You'd bend them sometimes to fit them into cameras. You had to do all this work in the dark because the plates were sensitive to light. And people would painstakingly prepare these plates, climb into the telescope, get lifted up into the air, load a plate in, point to the thing that they wanted to observe in the sky, and then they would just wait. And if you were lucky, you maybe only waited a few minutes or an hour or two. Some plates got exposed for multiple nights. You would point to a galaxy, open the shutter, and let light hit the plate, sit there all night, close the plate, go to bed, wait, come back the next night, point back to the same galaxy, and then do it again. So people would just pour days of their lives and hours of like shivering cold at the top of this telescope to get one image. So there was an astronomer doing this at the prime focus one night, high above the ground, and he was exposing one of these very long, carefully prepared plates. And his night assistant, who took care of turning the dome and making sure that this astronomer was safe, just wandered into the dome to see how he was doing. And the night assistant's jacket caught the light switch in the wall as he stepped through the door. So the lights just came flooding on in the dome and pouring into the plate and ruining nights of hard work. And the astronomer that this happened to supposedly just went berserk. He just started screaming, and you hear this howling from the top of the telescope going, "How dare you? It's terrible. I'm going to get down from this telescope and kill you." So to get into that high point, you would have to turn the telescope over to a ladder mounted on the side of the dome and then climb down the ladder. And telescopes don't move terribly fast. So this guy starts yelling, "I'm going to get down from here and kill you." And then he starts turning the telescope at an absolute snail's pace, just kind of going over toward the wall so he can get to the ladder. And the night assistant, meanwhile, is standing on solid ground going, "He seems really mad. He might actually be serious. I might not want to let him down until he's feeling less murdery." And the night assistant couldn't stop him from turning the telescope, but the night assistant could turn the dome that the ladder was attached to. So what you wound up with was this ridiculous spinning game of chase with the astronomer flying through the air on this telescope, chasing a ladder that the night assistant was steering away from him, going, "I'm not letting you down. Calm down, calm down. I'm not letting you off the telescope until you stop threatening to kill me." And the lights are on the whole time, the dome's spinning around. It was just absurd. But those were the sorts of things that were at stake when you'd poured nights into a plate, and then something like flicking a light switch ruined it all.
Absolutely. We did have a question come up apparently in the chat where someone asked how much of our current work ends up being remote, where we don't get to have these fun experiences due to fully robotic setups. So that is, I think, a great question.
Yeah.
And I have not had to chase a night assistant, nor have I been chased with threats of death in the current day. Thankfully, the current cameras are not quite as bad, and we don't usually spend quite as long on things. However, I will admit that a lot of my observing does end up being either remote observations where you log in and you take your data from your home computer. It does mean that you have a better bed to sleep in. I will say that much. But the other side of it is, I think that a lot of it is still going on where there's people going up to the telescopes and running the telescopes. but oftentimes the astronomers are just logging in, or they just get the data sent to them the next day. And so part of the reason I think that you wrote this book was to, give these stories in immortality so that people don't forget where all of it came from in the future.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm really glad somebody asked this question, because I actually talk about that evolution of how we observe in the Last Stargazers, because there are telescopes like the Magellan telescopes in Chile where I still travel down and sit in the control room to do my observing. And then there are telescopes like the Apache Point Observatory in New Mexico, which my university, the University of Washington, is a founding partner in. And at that observatory, we are able to operate the telescope remotely. We install software on our laptops, and from it, we can operate the camera and tell the telescope where we want to point. But I wouldn't call that fully robotic, because there is still a telescope operator sitting on the mountain. And I'm usually communicating with them through a webcam or through a chat app and telling them, hey, is it cloudy in this part of the sky? If not, I want to point there next. Hey, there's 10 minutes left on this exposure. Hey, there's something looking a little funny with the instrument. Can you help me out? So sometimes what we think of as observing remotely makes the astronomer remote, but the telescope operators and the observatory staff, who we absolutely could not do our jobs without, are still there. And then we do have some telescopes that are operated according to a preset cue, or are operated completely robotically as though they are in space, where commands are set ahead of time and there is not a soul on the mountain. This has all gotten extra interesting, obviously, now during the pandemic, because it became impossible for a while to travel to telescopes, and operating observatories safely became really difficult. You'd imagine that astronomy is the most socially distant job there is, because we're studying things billions of light years away. But to keep our observatory staff safe, some observatories had to be shut down. And setting up a telescope to work remotely is not a trivial matter. It's not sort of just setting something up like a video game. So we've been kind of scrambling to find solutions in the middle of all of this.
Absolutely. Okay, well, so Emily, you have been observing at lots and lots of telescopes. I have been at a fair share as well. What is your best story you have, or that you've heard, about when something breaks on an observing run? I had something break the last time I went on a big observing run, but I was very happy. It happened on the 7th night out of 7, and it was at 3 a.m. And I said, okay, that's fine. Because I was absolutely exhausted from 6.5 nights of great weather and great working instruments. But what's your best something broke story?
So my best personal something broke story, I'll kind of leave as a bit of a teaser for the book, because it's actually how I opened the book. But it was a point where I was at risk of breaking one of the largest pieces of glass in the world. It was a mirror that was 8.2 meters across. And just to give people some scale for that, when I talk about a mirror that's more than 8 meters from end to end, that's me standing beneath a mirror like that, just to get a sense of size and scale in this picture of how big these are. So my opening experience in the book is when I thought I was about to break something like that. I think the most epic story of a telescope breaking is gotta belong to Green Bank Observatory. So this is a radio telescope in Green Bank, West Virginia. And you can see the different design of a radio telescope, that instead of a shiny mirror, it's got this big sort of white mesh metal dish. And something I always like reminding people of is that we are looking at an extraordinarily shiny mirror for radio light, which has a much longer wavelength than the light that we see with our eyes. So that light will happily bounce off of a dish like that and treat it just like a mirror that we see when we're dealing with telescopes that operate at the wavelengths of light that we can see. So the Green Bank 300 foot was this exquisite, enormous telescope in West Virginia. 300 feet refers to the size of that dish from end to end. You can see how big it is relative to that building, relative to the little car parked in front of it. And this telescope worked flawlessly. It did amazing early research on surveying the entire sky to study objects that were emitting radio light, until one evening when it very abruptly turned from this into this. So it collapsed tragically and completely one evening. Very fortunately, nobody was hurt, in this collapse. But there are accounts told afterward of the person who was the operator on site when the actual collapse happened and the terrible sound that he heard. He luckily was not hurt, but he basically went sprinting up the road in his car to the next nearest radio telescope and brought people back. And he was telling them the telescope fell down, and they were going, really? Is he okay? Like, the telescopes don't fall down. Like, what actually happened? And there's this incredible story of them coming up the road and the lights from his truck just sort of illuminating this twisted wreckage of the observatory. And there was a whole inquiry into what had happened. I think it tracked back to a part that had been manufactured just a touch too weak to support the immense weight that was on it, and that eventually led to the collapse. Fortunately, a new enormous telescope was rebuilt in Green Bank. But I think anybody that hears this story and does then add a telescope when an alarm goes off or something goes wrong, and they're sitting there going, what's the worst that could happen? I think they're picturing this, because that is about as badly as a telescope could break and about as epically as something could fail.
At one point, I actually was a telescope operator for our telescope in Quebec for a couple months in order to kind of bridge between positions. And I was out there, I was operating everything. All the documentation was in French, and my French was not that great, so it wasn't the best. And I was out there for a week running this telescope. And during this week, it ended up that there was a large storm that came through, and there was hail. It was bigger than my wedding ring, and it was coming down. There was lightning, and finally that all ended. And that's when the phone rang, and I was down in the dormitories, and I went up to the main dome at that point because the fire alarm was going off, and the fire alarm was going off because the dome got hit by lightning. And it turned out there were a couple things that weren't quite grounded. And so it fried one instrument control board entirely. And yeah, but it was right as like that instrument was kind of the precursor to this lovely instrument on the Canada France Hawaii telescope called CETEL. And so then they had this brand new shiny instrument that was working perfectly that was in this lovely location. Or they had the instrument that they really had to babysit everything on in order to make it work in a site that didn't work as well for it. And so they haven't really redid that instrument as far as I know. And then it also fried one of the controllers within the spectrograph that I was there and helping people run. And so people were wanting to switch the grating and move the grating all around. I'm like, I can't even adjust the grating because the motor is broken, and I will break the spectrograph if I take it out. I don't know what to do. So I think that happens fairly regularly, that something happens. And how many lightning stories did you get in your interviews? Because we put these giant metal domes on the top of mountains. We're bound to get hit by lightning.
I had several people tell me stories of lightning hitting either the dome while they were in it or their dormitory. Elizabeth Griffin, the same woman whose story I shared about the bicycle, was sitting in the dormitory at, I believe, Mount Wilson when lightning struck the dormitory. No, it struck a tree directly next to the dormitory that effectively shattered, and the force of the strike shattered all of the windows in the dormitory inward. And they were eating dinner and were just sort of like gobsmacked that it had happened. And then people who are sitting in a dome when a lightning strike happens, domes are, like you said, they can be built to protect against such events, but people pretty collectively say that it's the loudest noise they've ever heard in their life. And I did get a great story from Dave Silva at when he was at Kitt Peak, actually, that he had a dome get struck by lightning, and the strike had basically vaporized a foot-long piece of cable. So he opened a door, and this waft of smoke blew out, and he thought that meant the dome was on fire. So he went running off to get, the safety crew on the mountain saying, there's a fire, and there wasn't. It was just the sort of vaporized remains of this conduit cable. But it was, the excitement on the mountain in what was otherwise a rainy and very stormy night. So, yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned Elizabeth Griffin and the dormitory at Mount Wilson. One of the one of the things I learned when I first went to Mount Wilson was that Captain, who is observing early on in the days of Mount Wilson, wanted to bring his wife with him when he went observing. And the general policy was absolutely not to any women coming at the time and staying in what they called the monastery, which the fire got like within 6 feet of during the last month. And they said absolutely not. They would not make an exception, but they really wanted him to use the telescope. They built a separate cottage so that he could bring his wife early on in the days of Mount Wilson, which has now been remodeled and is used for some of the guests for Chara, and it's one of the best places to stay on the mountain. Anyway, let's see. We did have another question come up, and it was one of our professors here at Embry-Riddle was asking if they let undergraduate students go to the large telescopes, or are they nervous about them messing them up? And I think both of us had experiences as undergrads using fairly large telescopes. I think I saw in your slide deck a lovely picture of you.
For this. Yep. So this is me. This is undergrad me in 2004 opening the dome of the 2.1 meter telescope at Kitt Peak. So that was my very first professional observing run. I was there with an advisor, but to be fair, any astronomer that's getting ready to do something with the telescope is not allowed to go unsupervised. We're always there with a telescope operator or with somebody who has experience operating the telescope. Operators are specifically trained to know every in and out of the telescopes, the instruments, the engineering, how to run them safely. And my training is more on the astrophysics and the science of what I'm doing. So it's crucial to have experts like that with you. But I got to observe as an undergraduate. I think people frequently bring undergraduates with them on runs. And it's really a wonderful learning experience. I remember during this run being told about early mistakes that my advisor had made when he was observing. I know he had been told those same stories by his advisor, because a common thing is that a student will arrive and be petrified to move and go, oh God, what if I break something? And there's this reassurance of, you learn by doing and you get used to the observing, and working with somebody who makes sure that nothing goes too wrong, like an entire telescope collapsing, gives you the freedom to kind of learn some of these skills. Or just as a follow-up, somebody posted, but the equipment there looks like 1985. Yes, it does. Observatories are not always, say, at the absolute hyper cutting edge of equipment that is used in the domes. I mean, this dome has probably been updated a bit from what it was like when I was there in 2004. I also imagine that it does not look like a control room that you would imagine in 2020, because a lot of times observatories will be built with the telescopes and equipment that work at the time, and then they keep working. So they just sort of stay maintained and stay operating until we're forced to do an upgrade. If any of you are familiar with the movie Contact, Contact features, as part of the story, detections of an alien signal using the Very Large Array in New Mexico, which I have a picture of here. And they filmed at the Very Large Array because this is this incredible array of 27 radio telescopes. It's so picturesque, it's so photogenic. And apparently the film crew had a blast getting out on the site, driving around the dishes and filming the movie star Jodie Foster, like driving through the dishes. And there's a very dramatic scene where she runs from the dishes into the control room. And the camera follows her down the road to the door, through the doors, up the stairs, down the hall. And then the doors to the control room swing open and they're on a set, because the crew saw the actual control room at the Very Large Array and was like, this isn't high tech enough. Your observatory looks like, an office from, 20 years ago. We can't put this in a Hollywood movie. So they built a control room that looked a little higher tech and a little more science-y, because they were so disappointed by what an actual control room looked like.
We at my at my last two places I was at as a postdoc, we certainly had undergrads go with us on observing runs. I took some out with me to the Lowell Discovery Telescope, which is a 4 meter. That one's brand new, so that one's that one doesn't have that same control room feel that was there with the 2.1 meter at Kitt Peak. But certainly, I think a lot of undergrads are able to go to these things whenever we're able to go again, whenever that is in the future. Hopefully, it will happen again. Let's see. So the last kind of thing that I always felt was part of an observing run was I always try to build in an extra day to go do something nearby. And there's got to be some great stories about people that have just gotten lost or gone to do some interesting hiking or anything like that. I don't know if you have anything like that in the book. I haven't gotten through the whole thing yet, but what kind of weird travel stories come out with going to these places?
I mean, people are getting to go to places like the Andean foothills in Chile or South Africa or the really remote corners of Australia. So anytime that you're able to build in a little extra time and explore the area is just wonderful. I found myself a lot of times having to sprint back home because I think people imagine that we spend a lot of our time at telescopes and that comprises the bulk of our job, and we're all teachers and we're all researchers and serving on committees, and a lot of us are spouses or parents or have a lot of other commitments at home. But it's one reason that traveling to the observatories is kind of nice because it is very immersive and it does just take you to some incredible places. I remember taking the chance a couple times at Mauna Kea Observatory on Hawaii's Big Island to go visit something like Volcanoes National Park, or even just get to go to one of the towns on the Big Island, which is my favorite island of the Hawaiian Islands. And it's just nice to get to see these really beautiful corners of the world. I don't think I know any astronomer who takes for granted how great these places are. In terms of the most extreme sort of travel, in terms of where I've had to go for places like this, I had to go to New Zealand to fly on SoFIA, which was quite an experience because I was observing objects that were in the southern hemisphere, and SoFIA is a telescope that flies. It's a telescope built in the back of a Boeing 747, and it'll take off oftentimes from California, but occasionally from New Zealand, and fly around the northern or southern hemisphere to observe by getting up to the stratosphere and then opening its back door so that the telescope can, point out and observe. So it looks like this. And getting to fly from Seattle to New Zealand to then get on another plane was one of the more absurd things I've gotten to do in the name of science, but it was such a cool trip to be able to take. Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, Embry-Riddle being an aeronautical university, a lot of our students become pilots, and several of the pilots for SoFIA are actually Embry-Riddle alums. So for those of you listening from Embry-Riddle, I wanted to do that shout out. And your professor will be hopefully flying on this plane at least once or twice in the near future if everything works out.
I will say I got the chance to interview the pilots for the book, and it was fascinating to talk to them. They had histories as commercial air pilots, military or test pilots, and they described the flight simulator that they used to train specifically for SoFIA, which is in Denver, Colorado. And it's the same kind of, it's a 747 SP, which is the same kind of 747 that carries the space shuttle. And I believe in California, that 747 SP is parked right up the road, and I think they occasionally get to take a part off it to work on SoFIA. But it was wonderful to hear them talk about what it was like to fly it, because the door in the back is engineered to open and close so smoothly that they don't notice. There's no perceptible difference to them flying the plane open or closed. The hardest part is timing, because you will be aboard this telescope saying, I want to point at that star for this amount of time. And you can see in this picture that the telescope doesn't poke out of the plane's fuselage. So to point at something, the whole plane has to turn. And then if you want to point at something for 3 minutes, the plane has to fly for 3 minutes, pointed in that direction. And they have these very intricate, very detailed flight patterns that they have to stick to within a matter of seconds. And that's a very particular skill as a pilot when dealing with turbulence, when dealing with small changes in level, when dealing with other planes. They've talked about the interactions they have to have with air traffic control over the U.S. if they're doing flights over the United States, and have to explain sometimes we should not have to get held or redirected because our flight plan is very, very specifically dictated. When we were flying in Christchurch, we flew right out of the international airport, and it was wild. We were, waiting in line for takeoff behind an A380, and they were explaining if there are takeoff holds, it can throw off an entire night of observing plans. So that work that those pilots do is just astonishing.
Yeah, that is amazing. So the last thing that we always do as astronomers is we often try to travel and go see all these amazing places and use these incredible telescopes that are really at the outer ends of the Earth. And then we get home and we have this data on a hard drive. Now it's not on plates anymore, thank goodness. And hopefully we find something interesting in it. And I couldn't bring you into a talk, Emily, without having you talking about the coolest, weirdest type of star that has ever been discovered that you found. So could you tell us about the time that you went observing and found these weird objects that are called Thorns Objects? And I may have just mispronounced that. So
pretty close. So.
Okay.
So Thorns Objects, I can start with an artist rendition, and I'll show you why in a second, but Thorns Objects are these fascinating theoretical class of star that were predicted by Kip Thorne and Anna Zhitkov back in the 70s. And what we're basically imagining is stars that from the outside look normal. They look like a big cold red star, kind of like Betelgeuse. But a star like Betelgeuse or a star like our sun or pretty much any normal star that we know of works because it's fusing something in its core. It's fusing hydrogen into helium or helium into carbon, and that fusion creates energy that is able to counterbalance the sort of squish of the star's own gravity. And they imagined a star that looked outwardly normal, but was supported not by fusion, but by principles of quantum physics. And by basically swallowing something called a neutron star, which is this tiny, dense little quantum star remnant left over when a star dies. So we imagine that they form like this, where a big red star swallows a neutron star, and then you wind up with this very bizarre new model for how stars can work. And it was a really cool idea, but the stars are very hard to find because they look normal from the outside. The only prediction that anybody was ever able to make was that their chemistry might be a little weird, that having that neutron star buried deep inside the star meant the neutron star was invisible, but the influence of the neutron star would mean that we saw weird amounts of elements or weird sort of features in data from the star. So my colleagues and I went looking for these at some point. I study big cold stars as one of my main research areas, and we were curious as to whether we could successfully identify something like this. We went on an observing run at Magellan, at this beautiful telescopes in Chile that were my favorite place to visit, and we did a search using a type of data called spectroscopy. So when you're taking a normal picture of a star, you just capture all the red light or all the blue light or all the white light, or you sort of pick a color and you capture the light from the star and you take a picture. In spectroscopy, you capture all the light from the star and you sort it out according to its color. So you put the blue light at one end and you put the red light at the other end, and you kind of see how much light the star is emitting at each different color. And you might occasionally see a spike where a particular atom is emitting extra light, or a dip where an atom is absorbing light. And from that, you can get something of a chemical fingerprint of the star. And we were hoping that we could use these fingerprints to see if one of these stars was a Thorns object. Now, I'm showing you the artist's rendition because spectroscopy is scientifically very powerful. It is the ugliest data you've ever seen in your life.
You haven't taken interferometry.
Oh, I have. Oh, even at least with interferometry, it's sort of a picture. It's a bad picture. But this disappoints every reporter that I've ever showed my data to, because they say, "Oh, do you have nice, beautiful data?" I'm like, "No, I got stripes." But this is light captured from a Thorns object that we've sorted out from top to bottom over and over, measuring how much light we're getting at every different wavelength and every different color. And this was the first glimpse we got of a star that later turned out to be a discovered Thorns object. And staring at it at the telescope, it looks like this. We had a colleague with us, Nydia Morel, who is a brilliant observer, and she was pretty much able to, by eye, read data like this, like a map, and identify some key features in it. And she spotted these sort of little bright dots, and she knew that that was unusual for stars like this, and she piped up saying, "I don't know what that is, but I know that I like it." And about a year later, when I was analyzing the data, it turned out that that light was light from glowing hydrogen atoms that were being excited by the star being a little unstable and pulsing. And those hydrogen atoms that glowed were accompanied by weird atoms that absorbed light. And it turned out we really had found the first evidence of a real Thorns object. But it came from this very funny looking data, and then it came from months of, like you said, coming back to my laptop after being at the telescope and processing the data to see what we found. So we don't have very many eureka moments at telescopes. There are occasional ones. I tell some of those stories in the book. I think the discovery of the first Kuiper Belt object, so these little rocky bodies far out in our solar system, was at the telescope Eureka. But for the most part, it's not, my God, we found it. It's, that's weird. And then sort of going back and poking at it later and realizing what we found.
So I would like to just say thank you one more time for coming tonight, Emily. This has been absolutely wonderful. And I am sure that any of the students watching this are having fun. And if they didn't get to watch it tonight, then I'll make them watch it during my observational techniques class next semester. But I really appreciate you taking the time to come in. So if there's no other questions coming through, I would just like to promote Emily's book. It is absolutely an enthralling look at some of the misadventures of astronomers as we travel around the globe to get this glimpse of starlight as it falls upon a mirror after traveling for a distance of billions of light years in some cases. But it's a great, great book and a wonderful author. And so I would like to thank her once again for coming, and thank you to Eric, who's behind the scenes and helped coordinate a lot of this for the planetarium and to stream this online. So I thank you very much for all of your time and the ambition and your enthusiasm that went into this book. I think it's an absolute treasure. So thank you.
It was a blast, right? And thank you for inviting me to do this. It's great to get the chance to talk to everybody.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Emily. And thank you, Eric. And have a great evening, everyone.